I've, Ellie, the essay regarding the Stanton Center donation. I have not yet.
Finding something to bang. Good morning. The Finance Committee meeting is called to order. It's February 2nd and the time is 10:32. All members are present and we have Alderman Arnett here as well. Thank you. Can I have a motion for the approval of the agenda?
Move to approve the agenda as written.
Second.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes as written for the January 19th meeting?
Move approval of the minutes from the January 19th meeting.
Second.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Thank you. We're going to go right into the supplementary appropriations, and we'll begin with discussion on SA 15-22. I understand that we'll need to postpone action on this. So can I have a motion to postpone action until we contact the donor on SA 15-22, unless there are some questions?
I move to postpone action.
I'll second that.
Get further information.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Next on the agenda is a MTA grant fund, SA 18-22. I don't know if Dr. Dua is here to speak to it. If not, Jody, could you give us a briefing on this grant fund?
Yeah, I just sent off an email to him to see if he was going to jump on, because if you want to know any details about the project, he's going to have to answer them. But this is a supplemental allocation of $112,000 to spend some money that's been given to us from the Department of Transportation of the state. They need to purchase a sky lift for the maintenance area. And I don't know, we put some detail in here about last year because we asked for this money last year in the budget, and they weren't able to get the purchase order issued in time to use last year's budget. So we're asking for it again this year, and they're going to do the 20% local match with some salary savings they've had this year because of vacancies. So we'll be transferring some funding over from the salaries and benefits line once they're ready to purchase.
He was kind enough upon request to send me a picture of what we were talking about, which basically looks like some sort of platform lift.
Yeah, to lift the vehicles up and work on their underside.
I will open it up to questions or discussion.
I have my hand up, but I'll go on.
Oh, there it is. Blending in there.
Ms. Dickinson, the allocation that was indicated in last year's budget, when it was not used, did that go back into the general
Yeah.
fund, or was that?
No, it's a grant. It was a grant appropriation. And if we didn't spend it, we just left it unused in the grant fund. It would just been a spending authority that was set up that was never used.
Okay, and then clearly this required a match. And so that's where Dr. Dua has to come up with the additional
20,000.
Yeah.
$20,000. Yes, out of salary savings is where he'd like to take it from.
And I would assume, and he's not with us to answer the question, but there is available revenue in his salary account.
I can tell you that they've had a few vacancies that they've been holding all year. I don't know if it's intentional or not intentional, but they've had a lot of vacancies. So they have some savings on the salary side to cover it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Alderwoman Finlayson. Is one of those vacancies the Director of Transportation?
Yeah, that would be some of the savings. We are paying Dr. Dua acting out of class now, but that still doesn't make up the difference in savings that we're making from having that position vacant.
It's actually it's Dr. Dua's position that's really not being paid because he's being paid as the director.
Yeah, but there are also some driver positions that are vacant right now as well.
What is the term for that? You mentioned it last finance meeting when we
acting out of class.
When we use projected staff savings to fulfill a match. I think Alderwoman Finlayson knows what it
Turnover?
is.
Attrition.
It can be attrition, turnover. There's a couple of terms we use.
Okay, I'm thinking of something else. It was used to address the match when we use staff to address the match. We use staff.
Oh, so that's not the same thing. That's when we use staff time that we're already paying to demonstrate that it's a soft match. That we say that we were already paying somebody to do a job, but we can use that payment of salaries toward a match on a grant. That's called a soft match. This is a hard match. We actually have to use some of our spending authority that we were going to use for salaries and move it. We need cash to buy the skylift. The skylift is going to cost $138,800, and the grant is $112,000. So we need to make up the rest of that cash payment with our own funds.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
I do have another question for David, if I might. I'm sorry, City Manager Gerald. You just mentioned that Dr. Dua is being paid as a director. In the past, it was they received 5% on their salary. Is that only for the first 6 months? And then after the action we took at the last meeting, it would revert it back to the actual director's salary?
Yeah, do you know, Director Dickinson?
He's still only being paid 5%. That's acting out of class. And what the city manager was saying is that it's like he's filling one position and the other one is vacant. But actually, he's just making the acting out of class add on to his salary still.
I was hoping what I heard was correct, though. But
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, and forgive my informality, Director Dickinson. Sometimes I slip and call you Jody, and that's not appropriate. So anyway.
I'm probably more apt to answer if you call me Jody than Miss Dickinson.
Okay, can I ask for a motion to recommend favorably or unfavorably SA 18-22?
Madam Chair, I'll move a favorable recommendation for SA 1822.
I'll second.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay. We have, yes. We have this appointment. It was concerning me last meeting because he was the one sole FAC member that we didn't recommend, but his application came in a little bit later. This is AP 18-22 for the reappointment of Jim Cardillo to the Financial Advisory Commission.
Is he with us this morning?
Hillary is, yeah.
Yeah. So my apologies that you didn't receive Mr. Cardillo's reappointment in the last batch. It's because I thought that he was an audit committee member and then that made him automatically a FAC member. It was the other way around. So that's why I didn't submit it. Just wanted to make sure that was clear, that there was nothing, we weren't hesitating on requesting his reappointment. I think he's known to all of you. He's very active on both the audit committee and the FAC, has an excellent resume, and he does wish to continue. And he was recommended by the chair as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, our past practice has been to have the candidate, if it's an initial appointment, come before the committee. But for reappointment, we don't require or haven't required that. And so I would make a motion that we give a favorable recommendation to Mr. Cardillo to the FAC, Finance Advisory Commission.
Okay.
Second that.
Thank you. All in favor signify by saying aye for a favorable recommendation.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Congratulations, Jim, if you're listening. He probably is. We do have legislation. No, we have an information session here. It's a discussion that I had asked for the last meeting in response to the Public Works project at Compromise Street. So this is ID 11-22, Capital Project Fund, Public Works, FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant. We asked for a full accounting of the funds. And IKEA, if you haven't, it is on I legislate these slides to walk us through. I think we have City Manager Jarrell here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Tiki, if you could display the presentation, or Julian or whoever's, there we go. Okay. So we're going to talk about both the available funding as well as the project costs, and then some of the areas that we're pursuing funding. So next slide, please. Okay, so as you know, we've been working on the City Dock project for quite some time. And when I talk about the City Dock project, I'm talking about 3 separate projects. We've got broken into 3 projects. On the Compromise Street side, the area that's by Newman Park and Newman Street is the first phase. And then as you move towards Main Street, the area that's by Donner parking lot in the circle is the second phase. And then the third phase is the one that everybody knows about, the bigger project that we're doing as part of the AMRP project. So the Compromise Street project has been around for a while, and we've been seeking grants for that. And you can see the list of state grants. They've been giving us $1 million or $2 million each year to get that project started. We used $2 million of the state funding to do the planning and design for that project. And both phases 1 and phase 2 are fully designed. And phase 1, if it's not already out for bids, it's going out for bids soon. So that project's moving forward with the money that we have available, to include the FEMA grant for $3.389 million. And that's what prompted this whole discussion, was the fact that the FEMA grant increased from $3 million to $3.389 million because FEMA had additional money that they could put against this project. So that was a supplemental appropriation for this project. Over the years, we've also added some city funding to the CIP to the tune of about $2.8 million. We anticipate that we'll have a concession payment that's going to be available from Hillman Garage that would go towards this. So if that is applied to it, we have roughly $30 million that's available, or that's been committed to these 3 projects, of which $2 million as I mentioned, has been expended. So next slide, please. And that will talk about the actual cost for each of these projects. So I mentioned Compromise Street, the design and pre-construction work was $2 million. That include, I don't know if you all remember the archaeological work that was done in Newman Park. I guess last spring. It was just before the memorial was completed and opened up last year. That work was done. They opened up that whole area to investigate for archaeological remains. So phase one, 12.5 million is moving forward with the funding that we have available, as I mentioned. The phase two construction for 10 million is currently unfunded. So those two for a total of 24.5 million, and then the 39.5 million for the Dock Street side of things, and that's both design and construction. So the total of all of those is 64 million. If you go back to the slide just before, you can see that we actually have about 30 million that's committed if we apply the $16.5 million concession payment. So 30 million that's available, 2 million of it already spent towards the 64 million. So we're very actively pursuing money. I don't know if any of you saw, I know Alderwoman Tierney saw it, but there was an article in the Washington Post about cities that are using lobbyists to help them pursue the federal funding. We've actually used one over the last year to help both with the COVID money that's available, but also on this project. But if you could go to the next slide, please. These are some of the sources of funding that we've identified. We recently submitted a grant application to the Economic Development Administration, $4 million for the design of the City Dock project. We think that we'll have a good opportunity for the Defense Communities Infrastructure Program, since we're right next door to the Naval Academy, and those are the types of projects that they're looking for there, is to put money into communities that are either close to or that military bases are part of, to help with resilience issues. The RAISE grant through DOT is going to see a lot of the infrastructure money that was passed by Congress, as is the BRIC funding through FEMA. Hazard mitigation grant program is the program that we got the $3 million, 3.389 million for the Compromise Street side. So we think that some of that will be available as well. And we're still hoping that the Resilience Financing Authority will be formed and be able to provide funding as originally anticipated. I mean, that's a big part of the reason that was set up, and that the enabling legislation was passed by the state, was so that they could help fund the City Dock project. So that's where we are. We're working all of these different angles. We're in close contact with the governor's office, with Senator Cardin and Senator Van Hollen's office, and Congressman Sarbanes to help us to gain as much of this funding as we possibly can to close that funding gap that we currently have. So happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Alderwoman Finlayson.
Thank you. And thank you, City Manager Gerald, for this presentation. It answers a lot of questions. I'll start from the end, which was the Resilience Financing Authority. When that is all in place, will we then be competing with Odenton and Glen Burnie and other communities within Anne Arundel County? Or will we become a priority, since our project is kind of the foundation for this authority to begin with?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So eventually we will be competing with the county, but not with the City Dock project. The City Dock project, everybody has always agreed that's going to be the first project out of the box for the Finance Authority, because that was sort of the genesis for that whole initiative, was trying to raise money for City Dock. So there's an agreement that that'll be the first project out, but then after that, there'll be a prioritization process where we will be competing for other projects, such as, studies of some of the low-lying areas and what can be done with those, with the counties, many projects that they have as well.
Well, that's great to hear. Thank you. The Naval Academy, I have not seen their plan. So I guess my question is, how does our plan work with theirs? Because we're creating a barrier or a buffer, or, I don't want to call it a wall. But then there's a Naval Academy right next door. So are they in the works? Is the Army Corps of Engineers doing, at one time they told us that they were just going to protect their buildings, that they were going to, flood the first floors and, use the upper buildings. That was years ago. Do we know what they're doing now? And are they working with us to make it a continuous protection all the way around the Annapolis area?
Yeah, so the answer is yes. They've hired a consultant, and their consultant's preparing options for them. They've shared that with us for years now. I've been on a steering committee with them that they set up to look forward towards what the expectations are for sea level rise and how to deal with those. They have a lot of smart ocean engineers and oceanographers there that are very well versed in this whole sea level rise issue. So they set up this group to advise the superintendent on all matters that's related to this. So we've been participating in this. Originally, it was Miss Craig and myself that participated in that, and others have joined since then. But yeah, they have a consultant that's working on it. They're very interested in seeing what our plans are going to be, because we're ahead of them on this whole initiative. So because we're ahead, they're going to have to sort of follow and make sure that we have a good tie-in. But there's going to be a lot of focus as we're doing the design for City Dock on Gate 0, because Gate 0 over there at the end of Prince George Street is the connection point, right? So that's where our plan needs to meet their plan, and they need to be coordinated. So they completely understand what our schedule is and are anxious, eager to participate in our process so that we coordinate that one spot over there and make sure it's a cohesive solution that works for both of us. Because as everybody knows, the water will seek its level, right? So if it can't get over on our part of the property, it will come over there and it'll flood over into our downtown area. So they need to have a plan as well.
So they know our timeline, they have a whole lot more money than we do to make the connection.
Well, it seems like they have more money, but it's a very competitive process in DOD for the sea level rise, especially within the Navy, because almost all the Navy bases are on the shore, on the coast. So they are all fighting for dollars. So, when you think about Annapolis competing against places like Norfolk and San Diego that have many ships and submarines and other operational forces, it's a tough competition. But I think that there's a lot of interest in supporting the Naval Academy and keeping it in operation. And they've got to provide that funding, or that place is going to just be flooded all the time.
Well, we have a secret weapon, and that's you, Dave, City Manager Gerald, because you have a unique knowledge of at least San Diego that most others do not have. So you use it.
Yeah, and we have a really great working relationship right now with them. We meet with them every other month. And they being, it's more the base people, the Naval Support Activity, the commanding officer and the Public Works Director for them and their deputy commanding officers. So we can just talk through issues. And that's always one of the main issues that we talk about. But there's, just issues in general that we have with them.
Two more questions. Can you tell us briefly, not in minute detail, what the 2 million that we've already spent was used for?
Yeah, it was design of the projects on the compromise street. So those are shovel ready. They're ready to be put out for bids and start getting bids and moving ahead with it. All the design work is complete.
Okay, and my last question, and the thing that bothers me about slide number 2, and you know what's coming probably, the concession payment and the fact that we are still counting on that 16.5, and I contend that we need to subtract from that amount an amount that's going to go to transit. I don't want us to count on all of that funding when we know we have another responsibility. And maybe I need to get with Jody to come up with what that number should look like so that it's reflected in all of our documents, that a certain amount of that concession payment goes back to transit. So.
Yeah, and the other factor to factor in there is the money that we'll be getting from the remainder of the parking area that they're going to be responsible for. It's estimated at just under $1 million now, but you know that's the other piece of this is that annual payment that we'll get from the concession payment as well.
Well, maybe we can ask Chairman Tierney, ask Ms. Dickinson to kind of give us a look at what transit is going to cost and where we have funding coming into transit and where there's a shortfall in transit. So we can figure out how to fill that shortfall. I'm sorry, Ms. Dickinson, but.
Right. Director Dickinson, could you explain first the relationship between the revenue that we anticipate for this project and what funds it goes to? And also to Alderwoman Finlayson's point, can we predict how much transit will need to be supported?
That's a multi-layer question there. So I'll say that in our transportation fund gets a substantial amount of funding from the state transportation grants. So we have, and I can't tell you the percentage off the top of my head of what we have to come up with ourselves. The last time we did a regular full 12-year budget, it was somewhere around $2.8 million that was necessary from the parking fund. So if you think that we're still going to need to subsidize the difference from the parking fund, and that we do make some net profit off the other garages. I don't recall what that amount was. I did a quick analysis at one point in time to make sure that the revenue from those other garages is enough to pay the current debt service that we have outstanding for debt issues from the past. And there was some excess that was would be available for the subsidy, but it was not a significant amount. It was I believe it was in the hundreds of thousands, not to the tune of 2.8 million. So presumably then we would need to come up with some additional money, and that would come from the waterfall, as we're calling it, from the Hillman Garage project. And that their current projections are saying at least $950,000 coming in annually from that net revenue flow from Hillman and the surrounding parking area. So that would go towards that effort as well. Now you're asking me what transportation is going to cost. That's another issue. I don't know if transportation is going to be the same, if it's going to start to cost more, if it's going to cost less, if we're going to continue the same level of services, if we're going to change our level of services. That I'm not experienced enough to tell you what the cost of transportation is going to be in the future. Because as we know, there's discussion about buying the electric vehicles, doing more on-demand routes, things like that. So I can't project that unless we have a certain, a plan in place, and then we can start to put together what the changes of cost will be, up or down.
Let me just ask, to appease Alderwoman Finlayson, we have two
I don't want to
exercises.
be appeased.
Well, no, to address your concern,
Thank
So
you.
I can try to analyze revenues based on what we have now and project them forward
but
and see
doesn't,
what we think will, but I don't know what transportation is going to cost in the future.
but
May
don't I'm go. Oh,
May I clarify? Because I don't want to be appeased. I just want answers. Thank you.
I'll use any word you want.
Could you provide us with a historical accounting of what transit has cost us on an annual basis? What revenue has been generated from state and federal grants? And what revenue has been generated from our parking? So that we can see a trend. And if we make changes, no matter how significant or insignificant, we can always apply those changes. But I think we need to look at what is today. And maybe today is worst case scenario, that we need, $2.8 million. But maybe it's not with all of these other innovative ideas, but we need to see a clear picture of what transit has cost us. And if nothing changes, what it will cost us. And then, like I said, we can apply the changes and reduce that amount, but we need to see numbers. And I know it's there. I mean, I think we've seen it in the past. So, but I really need to see the numbers. I need to know what I should be asking for transit in 23 if nothing changes. Okay, so that's what.
To address your initial request to possibly allocate some funding to transit, don't we have a commitment to use the revenue from parking to put that into our transit fund? The $950,000 that we are getting a year, is that considered parking revenue, or is that considered?
It's initially parking revenue, and it'll go into the parking fund as revenue.
Okay.
And then we transfer it over to the transportation fund as a revenue source for them. So it comes into parking, gets recorded there, and gets transferred to the transportation fund.
So it's safe to say that we're going to be getting $950,000 a year for transit.
If the projections that the AMRP studies have shown come to fruition, and they've told us those are very conservative numbers. So, and I believe they're very conservative numbers. So that 950 is a baseline. It may be more. It may be significantly more. So that all could be targeted towards transportation.
I think, and I don't want to read it wrong, but I think there might be concern that $950,000 or whatever it may be will go to construction at City Dock.
I don't think that's the plan right now. We would like to
so.
use as much as the concession payment as possible for City Dock.
Correct.
Because that is a substantial amount of funding. And since that concession payment comes from borrowing, it's better to be placed onto a construction project. So.
Okay.
Well, may I respond? I am not concerned that 900,000 will be reallocated. I am concerned overall that there is not adequate funding for transit. That's the bottom line. Whether it's that 900 plus additional, whatever. But unless we know what it's going to cost us, we can't begin to project what we need. So that's why I'm asking, look at the historical amounts that we have spent on transit over the last, 5 years, 10 years, whatever.
Yeah.
And then we can say, like I said, if nothing changes, we know what we need at the end of the day for transit.
Yeah, the other piece of this that we'll have to figure out, Director Dickinson, is that what happens is that the revenue flows into the parking fund. The parking fund pays all of their costs, all their expenses, and then whatever is surplus is available to transfer to transit. Part of the equation that I'm not sure that we figured out yet is how much we're going to save by not having Hillman Garage as part of the operations cost for the parking fund. So that will help. It hurts on the revenue side, but it helps on the expense side that we're no longer maintaining that facility.
And the 950 is a net amount coming from Hillman, meaning that's after they've taken off their operating expenses. So we won't be incurring the expenses. We'll be getting that net revenue.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question from Alderman Arnett. And go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to step back to slide 3 where that magic number $64 million shows up. And when we first started hearing from AMRP, magically the amount of the concession payment was going to be something in that neighborhood. And it actually could have gotten greater if we had thrown in our other garages. It's now down to the $16.5 million. And I think Alderwoman Finlayson is exactly correct in focusing in out of that 16.5, which is a one-time only bolus of money, as I understand it. That's not 16.5 million a year. That is it. Comes whatever we're going to do on City Dock, any potential Hillman Garage overruns, and then whatever we're getting out of there for the transit system, which Director Dickinson just told us the transfer annually from the parking fund to transit is 2.8 million or thereabouts. And we are talking about 0.9 million. Clearly, we already know there's going to be a shortfall for transit. And so then the big question is, where do we make up that money? And I think in earlier discussions with the city manager, we were looking to the general fund. I don't know what other source we have than to finance it out of the general fund revenues, which are largely property tax revenues. And it is going to be, it's hard to believe it can't be a burden. Now, we know what the history of the transit system is. We can look at our budget binders, and every year we have all of that transit detail, and it really hasn't changed that much. It's really needed this significant transfer from parking to transit. I also think Alderwoman Finlayson is correct. We're talking about bigger transit. We're talking about more circulator trolleys, which I think are good, and that they're electric, I think is good. And also waterside additional transit. So I think we're actually looking at more transit expenses rather than fewer, and particularly given the Transportation Board is now offering us the idea that we should not collect fares, which is another $330,000 a year of revenues that we don't get. So Alderwoman Finlayson, I support you and then with you on, we've got this huge missing piece that we're sort of having hang out there. And I think there's sort of an implied hope that the amounts of money that are going to be generated from these sources is going to be much better than are shown in the numbers from AMRP, but it's got to have to be a lot better for these numbers to come together in transit to have the money that it needs. I guess unless I've really misconstrued things, I think that we really do have, as a city council and as stewards of our system and delivery of services, we really do have a legitimate near-term crisis about how we're going to finance transit and I think that the $16.5 million is being set up to do a lot of different things, only some of which it can do. I mean, if we do have a significant overrun on the cost of Hillman Garage, am I not correct? That has to come out of that $16.5 million?
No, that's not correct. And that's
Okay.
what we're negotiating now is who owns those risk allocations, because, you know, part of the reason why we have a developer is that they take on those risks.
Okay.
They've done all the due diligence, they've done the design, they've done all the planning. So that a lot of the risks they're going to own. The overrun, the late performance, those are all owned by the developer.
That's a relief.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot packed into what you said, but there's a lot that I would not agree with. We never said that the concession payment was going to be 64 million. We said that the estimate of the total revenue was 64. Now it's 47. The original number for the concession was 30 something. Now it's 16. It has declined, but it hasn't declined from 64 million.
Can I just have a time? Can I have a timeout here? I'm not sure what you're used to at finance committee meetings, but we're way off topic. And I know we're having a work session on this issue where all these concerns are going to be addressed. Would you rather proceed that way, or do you want to continue this discussion? It sort of morphed into transit. I was particularly interested in the Compromise Street project, that is shovel ready, and it's $12.5 million, where it's grown threefold from the original estimate. That's all history, we know that. But are those FEMA funds directly earmarked to that project so that it can be completed? Are we allocating $12.5 million from the FEMA grant for that project?
Correct. The FEMA grant will help pay for the first phase of the Compromise Street project.
So we're not securing enough to complete the project. Is that what I'm hearing? I just don't want to start a project and then stop because of necessary funds.
We wouldn't put it out for bid if it wasn't funded. So phase 1 is funded, phase 2 is not funded. So although that one's designed, that one is not going out for bids yet until we can obtain the funding. And we still need to determine the acquisition strategy for that, because that project's going to be working in the same area near Donner Lot that the AMRP project is. So
that may be morphed, not morphed is the wrong word. Combined to phase 3. Okay. When is the construction to start on the Compromise on phase 1? This spring? Or
definitely not this spring. So we got a lot of the funding from MDE, and they require several months to review the bid packages after we get the bids in. So it probably won't be until later this year, maybe after the boat show.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I don't think our discussion is out of order at all. I want to thank Manager Gerald and Ms. Dickinson for giving us this slide presentation that we asked for, information that we asked for. And I think it is very timely if we have questions pertaining to what is on these slides. So to delay it, I don't think is appropriate. And transit must be part of this discussion. You know, we cannot ignore it. And that is my great concern. We have to keep transit in front of us. Everything else is important also, but so is transit.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm just following the minutes from last meeting and my objective in addressing this particular project. Yes, this information is helpful and we can expand the discussion. I just wanted to conclude on the Compromise Street project. So to continue, we can opt to continue to discuss the City Dock project in its entirety and the relationship between parking and transit. Alderman Arnett, do you have a question?
I think I'm going to ask for some other forum with the city manager and the finance director. I think City Manager Gerald has pointed out that I am misinformed on a number of points. I don't want to remain misinformed, but if this is not the forum to get that corrected, I need another forum.
I do want to say one thing on what you said, Alderman Arnett. The free transit proposal is it's just a proposal. I know it's out rumors that this is something that we're going to implement, but just for the record, that's strictly a proposal. I do have Dr. Dua here if he wants to address Alderwoman Finlayson's concern about the transit budget. I did look that the transit budget did increase substantially from projection of 21 to 22, over $1 million. So Alderwoman Finlayson's concerns are very valid. Would you like to speak to them, Dr. Dua?
Good morning. Can you repeat the question?
First, from my first question is, because we're talking about transit now, what was the reason the projected cost of transit went up so substantially from 21 to 22?
I don't have the numbers here. Jody, do you have them? Because I do only have the...
Not in front of me. And I think that comparing 21, remember 20 and 21 were both materially impact on the expenditure side by COVID. We cut back on routes, cut back on staffing for those routes. So if you're looking at actual expenses compared to a budget, the budget in 22 is going to presume normal activities, whereas 20 had a very impacted fourth quarter, and FY21 was impacted for most of the year. So I don't think we can compare them like that. I don't have that comparison in front of me, but the actual expenses versus the budget wouldn't be helpful. We'd have to take a look at what a normal year would look like.
Yeah, it is all, I think, COVID related, and I just didn't know how it was trending, if it was trending upwards because of that. So to Alderwoman Finlayson's request, should we go back 5 years?
Whatever is appropriate, given the fact that COVID was impacted the last 2 years. But I would prefer...
That's easy to put together, a 5-10 year look at expenses and how much was subsidized by other means.
So I would appreciate giving Ms. Dickinson and Dr. Dua an opportunity to go back and do the research instead of putting them on the spot at this moment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Is that something you could have by the next Finance Committee meeting?
I may have already pulled some of that together for the group that was looking at, that did the recent fair, free recommendation. They asked me for some historical information, and I may have pulled a lot of that together already, so I'll have to take a look.
Yeah, I know you're busy. Okay, why don't we add that?
I mean, so my only reason for telling you it may be more available is that I think I've already pulled a lot of it together.
Okay. All right, and so go ahead, Dr. Dua.
Just one comment on the transit. The department has other functions. So when you look at the transportation budget, not everything is transit. We can track the vehicle operations and maintenance specifically to transit. And then administrative costs is a share because we do have transportation planning, parking as part of that. So once we are looking at the road data, you may want to bear it in mind that while transit is a large share of the work that we do here, not everything is transit.
Okay. Takia, can you add that as an agenda item for the next Finance Committee meeting?
Sure.
Thank you very much. I don't believe we have to take action on this. It's just for information. Are there any more questions related to ID 11-22? Okay, being none, let's just move on to legislation. We have an ordinance 01-22, which is the fire protection code legislation. I am a sponsor of that, so I will give a synopsis as best I can. The objective, the primary objective of this legislation is to protect the historic inventory on Main Street when fires happen to these historic structures. They can't be replaced. I don't know if you were familiar with the Duke of Gloucester fire that happened almost 2 years now, and it's just sits vacant, and so that doesn't provide the city really with anything other than an eyesore. But the other reason is, I don't know if you remember before the pandemic, but our public safety testified before the city council and said really that the only fail-safe method to protect downtown are sprinklers. Sort of the weak link theory, if everybody has sprinklers and one doesn't, the fire will spread. They have optimized their response time to 2 to 4 minutes and all that. The legislation does have language in there. Let me back up. We hired a fire protection engineer who vetted this legislation more recently. And we did add language that if it was absolutely not feasible to put a sprinkler system in because of the historic fabric of these buildings, they would look at an alternate system, but they just didn't want to open the door to not sprinkling. We also, this legislation was drafted before the pandemic. We pulled it obviously because of the optics. So we had some time to add some stipulations. If you are using minority contractors, you do get, let me make sure I have the correct language here. There's 2 perks. One is loan related. Let's see, where does it say that? There is a sprinkler revolving fund that we put money in, and that's to give out a 1% loan, and they're available for the developer or the owner of the building. And there are tax credits provided by the historic HPC. If you do use MBE contractors, your loan amount goes from $20,000 to $25,000. And if you plan on using the space upstairs on Main or whatever, for residential, your loan is prioritized. Let me give you some background information too on what triggered this. Main Street repavement was delayed because of all this stuff happening at City Dock. And DPW at the time, in their great wisdom, thought, well, instead of repaving Main Street and then ripping the street all over again, let us think about what we want to have in the future. So the DPW did put in sprinkler lines from the main and towards the into the curbs, so that the building owner just has to tie into that connection at the curb. And so they're there waiting for them on Main and Francis Street is where we did this. So this legislation is only for Main and Francis Street where we have those runouts. However, we did have language that as we continue this, any commercial building within the city of Annapolis that subsequently benefits from the installation of adjacent underground lateral lines, that's what they're called, after the date of passage of this ordinance shall be sprinkled no later than 3 years from the date of the lateral line installation. This legislation gives them 5 years to sprinkle their building where we installed those lateral lines. If we continue to install lateral lines, it's a big if, they'll have 3 years to install a sprinkler system. So I think that's about it for my synopsis. Are there any questions? Alderman Arnett, you have your hand up. Is that from before or? You're muted too. So, are there any questions of Alderwoman Finlayson?
Yes, thank you. My question had to do with the sprinkler fund. And I think this is something that came up when we last had this discussion, I believe. The sprinkler fund is a revolving fund. And did we come up with a process, or do we have a process for residents' ability to access the fund? And how is it regenerated, or do we exhaust all of the funds in that account and then we have to wait a number of years to accumulate more funds before we give more grants? How does that work, or how will that work?
So I assume that question was addressed to me. I will say that the fiscal note tells you at the time we wrote the fiscal note, there's $343,000 in that fund. And that fund was initially set up and seeded with a contribution from the general fund. I don't remember what that amount was. That we have made a few loans in my time here, I think 3, and there's one more in process. And so it hasn't been many. And so we've been lending those monies out. I think the term is like 5 years and 1%. And we put the payments, the loan payments, back into the fund. That's why it's called revolving. They're all paying it back. So if we loaned it all out and everybody's paying in, you'd have an amount that would continue to rotate. Our fiscal note points out that if you do this program, there may be more applicants for the fund, for the loans, and that money would drain more quickly than it would if you didn't pass this legislation. So we may come to a point where the fund is low and the payments on the existing loans aren't enough funding for the new loans. So you'd have to consider whether the general fund would want to put some more seed money into that fund. And that's a consideration that we would take at the time we're developing the budget. If we think it's running low and we have a time frame set forth in this bill with a number of years to get things installed, and over that period of time, that fund might decline to a point where we need to put some more seed money, or just continue making loans. I mean, it could be just a first come, first served, and when the money's gone, the money's gone. And so that's the way that fund works. There's already an application process that has to go through us and has to go through the fire inspectors, the fire marshal's office, so that we know that they're getting the correct equipment in the house in accordance with the code requirements. So the process is already set up. We already have an application for it.
Can you tell me what the average loan amount is?
Not quickly. I can look it up while we're on the meeting. I have to go back a couple years.
Just a general idea. I mean, are we talking about $20,000 loans or $40,000 loans?
You're closer to 20, but I'm going to have to, I'll look it up. It won't take me but a minute.
Yeah, I just wondered, you know, what those amounts were.
They're limited to 20,000, except unless you are using a minority contractor.
Are they currently limited to 20,000?
That's what the code. Oh, I'm not sure. That's what this. I
would have to look that up, but I thought you were putting a limit on your legislation, right. So that we wouldn't quickly deplete.
Correct.
The fund. And so there was a limit set in this new legislation.
Correct. Yeah.
But in current practice, it doesn't sound like there is that limit. And so that was my question, what, you know. So, thank you.
I'll let you know. I'll raise my hand as soon as I have an answer for you.
Okay, thank you. Or put it in the chat. Do we chat? I guess we don't chat, do we? I don't see an opportunity to put
I
stuff
think we
in the chat.
stopped chatting on Zoom. I'm not sure.
No, we still chat in other settings, but not on this one, it appears.
That's the reason for the 5 years is, obviously to pay back the loan, but also the secondary effect of this is to revitalize the upper floors of Main Street. And even the fire department speaks to that in their letter of recommendation. We can reactivate the upper floors and make them code compliant for residential use. And I find that a real game changer downtown, ironically, to go back to the way things used to be where, proprietors lived above their stores or, just to introduce residential use up above would be, like I said, a real game changer. And that's a secondary effect of this. It's not really the primary objective, which is to keep the inventory from burning down.
Well, I would think that would be the primary to protect our historical buildings in downtown.
Correct.
And my questions don't question the merits of this legislation at all. I just want to know the process.
Oh, yeah.
And I see Ms. Dickinson is raising her hand. She really raised her hand as opposed to her little hand.
A little hand up in the
Real hand raiser. Go ahead.
So, yeah, so we had a $8,900 loan. We had an $11,500 loan, and we had a $16,100 loan. And I think these are all residential units, residential homes. So I don't know how that would compare to what you'd need for the businesses on Main Street and the fact that they use the upper floors for different things than the low. I don't know what that does to the sprinkler system. So there may be a different cost for the businesses.
Well,
So we're talking an average of 11 or 12.
so is it only folks in the historic district that are eligible, or are these for people all over the city?
This is, I believe the sprinkler loan is eligible for anyone. This legislation is targeted towards the Main Street area. The historic preservation tax credit is limited to the historic area. So that's limited. But this at present, the sprinkler loan, I'd have to look at the legislation. It may be limited to residents and not be able to be used for commercial buildings. So hopefully the legislation addresses that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was trying to find the code for the sprinkler fund. I know we have one.
17.20.030 is what I'm reading,
Yeah.
or somewhere thereabouts.
So I've been so focused on using it for commercial that I don't know about the residential. Alderwoman O'Neill has a question.
Yes, thank you. So my question is, I know the focus is on the commercial in this, and we're kind of talking back and forth between the residential commercial. Do we have any estimates on the actual cost for the commercial buildings in getting the sprinkler? Like if the loan is, 20 or topping out at 25, if they're using minority, is that covering the cost of the sprinkler, or are they having to subsidize for something else from somewhere else?
That's a good question. We don't have enough data. The most expensive part is the plumbing part of it to bring the water into the building itself. We have had a committee for several years on this, and the numbers are sort of all over the place depending on how difficult it is to pipe vertically, but also what they're doing as far as the distribution itself. If it's going to be exposed, that's less expensive than concealed ceilings and all that good stuff. So I'd look to Jody. I don't know if she has anything on Joe Rubino taking a loan at one point for the space above Cocapelli. That's sort of the model. Joe Rubino is a building owner downtown, and he used the loan to renovate, to sprinkle the building that had Cocapelli.
Right.
Now it's something else.
Right. And I was not correct before. It's eligible for loans may only be made to developers or owners for the rehabilitation of existing commercial or residential buildings. So it can be used for both. And the first paragraph says the purpose is for buildings in the historic district. So this may be limited both historic district, but can be used for both commercial and residential. The HPC may be the one that's limited to residential buildings, but I have to check on that. I know there's two different eligibility requirements for the two different programs. Not everybody's eligible for both.
And then I have a second question.
I don't know if I answered yours very well, but we don't have anything from, do you remember that loan on Cocapelli building?
No.
No.
The
Okay.
ones that I have, well,
It sounds like they're residential. Do you have,
the ones that I recall were residential. It could have been done before my time here,
sure.
the loan.
Okay.
And I have to look back in the historical accounting records to see if I could find that one.
I think Hollander just did one on the SunTrust building, but anyways, just next question, Alderwoman.
So my second question is, do we have, or are we able to get an accounting of, in the historic district, who has fire sprinkler systems, who still would need them in order to bring up this possibility? And that way we could then sort of target our marketing, so to speak, to those people, letting them know about this loan process. How would we go about doing that? Is that through the fire department? Is that through permitting department?
That's a really good question. To answer the first one, we do have an inventory that Bud Zapata has, he has it mapped, who's sprinkled and who's not downtown. As far as messaging that when this ordinance hypothetically is passed, city manager might have an answer to that.
Yeah, I would say it should be Steve Rice would take that to outreach to all the businesses. The businesses that have the owner that they had a few years ago know that we did this from the main to the curb line. So it's those that we're really trying to encourage the advantage of this since we did that work. But I think Steve would be an ideal person, that outreach to each of the businesses to encourage them to participate or let them know that they're going to be participate eventually.
And we're hoping the 5-year window gives them the time to develop a business plan to pay off the loan, and also it may give them the opportunity to do this in between tenants, which is something the Downtown Annapolis Partnership asked for.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, Alderman Arnett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As it happens on neither of the committees that this legislation is assigned to, so thank you for indulgence. I also share the enthusiasm for being downtown sprinkled, but I think there are some problems with this legislation in that, first of all, it applies to the city, particularly in the earlier parts of 1720. I'm concerned when you go to 1720-040 that we're making this apply only to, does not apply to single family dwellings or two family dwellings. Why not? And in fact, that's the preponderance of the dwellings that I have in my ward, and I think most of us have in our ward, and I don't understand why we would limit the sprinkling. You could say, well, that has to do with the fact that when you go into later sections, it has to do with the buildings in the historic district. But if you look on page 8, the historic district is struck by this legislation. So if I'm understanding this correctly, once again, it applies to the whole city, not the historic district. And I wonder if those are the changes that we really want to be making. If you go to page 5 and you see the application fee again, that's for all the city. Again, if I'm interpreting this correctly, and I'm wondering, it's hard for me to understand exactly why that wording was changed in 1720-060, and then further down in 1720-070. I mean, they may be legitimate, or appropriate, but maybe they're only appropriate for downtown. I can't quite determine. And then there are some questions I have that I won't get into now on 1720-110. But then when you do go back to page 8, 1720-120, it looks like it's striking the historic district as an amendment, which therefore I think means that it applies to everyone, which would be my preference. So I'm not sure that this language is doing what you, Madam Chair, are specifically focused on, which again is a focus that I share, and in fact was involved in the initial establishment of the sprinkler fund under then Mayor Moyer, and have always wanted to see those really important structures. Although I would like to see more than historic commercial structures. I'd like to see Joe Budge's house sprinkled, or any of the other really important homes in the historic district. But frankly, we should be wanting to sprinkle everybody. It is a demonstrated life safety issue. It also saves a lot of property. There are some confounding issues with sprinkling buildings that are plaster walls rather than drywall, and have cove moldings and things like that. But I guess I'm really concerned about the generic changes that are going on in this legislation that are affecting all of the city rather than just the historic district, and why we're not doing this legislation for single family dwellings, particularly since this has to do with inspections and the ability of inspectors to enter homes. I would think we would want them to have that ability to inspect any home and look at the sprinkling situation for any home.
Okay. I think it's sort of a multi-level question, if I understand it correctly. First off, I think to address residential, my predecessor, former Alderman Budge, worked on enhancing the sprinkler requirements for residential. So those are separate. This has
separate
been in the
code. Separate in the code.
That residential sprinkler requirements are addressed separately. This has been in the works for years, and this is a baby step. If you want to introduce legislation to sprinkle Eastport, I'm all for it, but it's a struggle. I had a demonstration down at City Dock showing, we had a trailer and we showed what happens with sprinkler and without, for the building owners. And I think from that, we got one applicant. It's that type of stuff to convince these owners that this is the right thing to do. So specific to your question on the scope, this has it's very specific on page 8, what this applies to. It is not the entire historic district. Want to make that clear before the pitchforks come out. This is not for the entire historic district. This is specifically, as described, the applicability on page 8. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or where you're confused on the language. And I'm not sure if we have an attorney on the call.
No, it actually doesn't. And in fact, I don't think I'm confused. If you look at Title 17, this is fire prevention writ large. It is not specific. 1720 is to fire prevention across the city. It is not specific. There are subsections that used to be specific to the historic district, but those are getting stricken by these amendments. And so now it does go back and make it broader, which again, I'm all in favor of, but I don't think we're really, I don't think this legislation is drafted for you and the other sponsors is really doing what you want it to do. And I can tell you, in terms of changing the fire inspection procedures writ large, I don't think it should be only commercial buildings, and I do think that it should be citywide. And certainly, if that's not the sponsor's druthers, I can have a set of amendments drafted up to make that clear. But 1720 is not sprinkling for downtown. It is fire. The title of that section is fire prevention. And it's under the building and construction is fire prevention citywide. But these codes restrict it to only certain kinds of buildings in the city, and specifically prevent the inspectors from looking at entry and examination. This subsection does not apply to single family dwellings or two family dwellings otherwise. Why not? Why wouldn't we want to have those inspected? And I think our overall goal is for those to be sprinkled. So, and again, I apologize. I know I'm taking up the finance committee's time, and I will go to economic matters only, but I think these are significant problems with the way the Office of Law drafted this, and they got into sections that really apply to the city writ large and make wholesale changes that certainly are not my druthers, and would encourage it to not be those changes to be supported by the rest of the council. Also, getting into the specifics of the revolving fund, that was always for downtown, and it was certainly timely when we were going to stub out the connections, sprinkler connections from Main Street, and anytime we dig up any other street and do it. As it happens, we're digging up streets in Ward 8 as well. And it might be time to think about any stubbing up for sprinkler systems there. I know there was work done in Ward 2, but again, I'm concerned with the way this is drafted, in that it really goes well beyond downtown and well beyond the revolving fund, and limits the things that the fire inspectors can do.
Okay, I think you're saying two contrary things. You're upset that we're editing what appears to be a general fire prevention code.
Right.
Okay, and to that point, we've definitely introduced specifics. I mean, on page 8, you see it. I don't need to read it, but I will read it. That it says, all commercial buildings located on Main Street or Francis Street in the historic district that are adjacent to existing underground lateral lines are required to be sprinkled no later than 5 years from the date of passage, blah, blah, blah. That's the applicability section of this right. Ordinance.
But go back to page 4. That's where the more generic changes are being made. And those, I believe, the way it's written, are affecting the entire city. Under section 1720, and it's affecting the what inspectors can inspect, and it seems to be saying they specifically don't inspect single family or two family dwellings. Why not? And don't we want them to be sprinkled?
I think that's the intent here, but I think I'll get clarification from the law office on why they chose. Well, there's Mr. Lyles, if he's able to Mr. Lyles, welcome. If I understand, hello. Alderman Arnett's question, and I'm looking at Title 17 in its entirety, do these edits negate residential inspections for sprinklers, et cetera. By editing this particular title, are we negating other application of sprinklers?
We didn't think that that's what we were doing, but the wording seems to suggest that. We passed it by the experts at fire, and they didn't make a point of it. To, you know, but we can review it and get back to you on that. This subsection in 1720.040 inspections, which comes under 030 and 010. Yeah. Yeah, we could probably add a word there that would carry out the intent that you wanted. I think the intent is you do want this to apply, inspections to apply to single family and two family dwellings. Is that right, Alderman Tierney?
I'm not sure if it's addressed elsewhere. I know John Manasseh looked at this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the legality of it really flows from what the experts are telling us they felt was reasonable and rational in the section. So I didn't tinker with it too much. I just wrote it as I was told to write it. It's legally sufficient if it meets your intention. If your intention is different, then we can draft it to meet your intention.
I was fine with it addressing the proposed sprinkler installation downtown.
Yeah, and I would think too that what we're talking about with fire inspections is really commercial fire inspections and not residential fire inspections. I thought that's what we were talking, because the fire code doesn't necessarily apply to residential buildings, because there's no inspection of residential buildings that you carry out right now, as I understand it.
Right.
You don't knock on people. We don't knock on people's doors and say, "Let me inspect." But for commercial properties, we do that all the time. That's part of our job. So, you know, that's probably why when we wrote it that way, that's why we wrote it, to make it clear that that's not part of the fire inspector's job right now. But it may be, you know, if you've got dwellings over or in or next to the historical commercial spaces that you're worried about with this particular change.
Yeah, I know, I can't speak for John Manasseh, but I know he looked at this as...
Well, John is here, so he can tell you himself.
He's on the call now.
He's on the call.
Oh, he is.
Yeah, he's here.
John, I'm not sure what you have in front of you, but we're discussing the ordinance to sprinkler main in Francis Street. And in the editing of chapter 17.20, Alderman Arnett is concerned that we're deleting any residential requirements, or maybe I should ask it this way: where are the residential requirements for sprinkler systems addressed with this legislation? Is it elsewhere?
That's a lot to sort of unpack. And also, just to let you know, it looks like Battalion Chief Ortlieb's also in the meeting now as well, so he could speak to some of that as also. But to try to summarize, requirements for sprinkler systems usually originate in the building code. We have this legislation before us, which creates a special location for sprinkler systems and requirements that are sort of outside the building code. Mm-hmm. I think what you're looking at in that section where it starts with 17.20.020, that's the fire prevention code for the city that's adopting the life safety code. Mm-hmm. And in line with what the state states, and the way the state adopts the fire code, and this is what the city attorney was speaking to, the state doesn't authorize the fire department to just go into single family dwellings and conduct fire inspections. So the way the state does it is they say, this is the fire code, but we're exempting 1 and 2 family dwellings from the reach of the fire code. And the way the city adopts that is with the same language that we're saying we authorize the fire department to do fire inspections, but that's not inside of 1 and 2 family dwellings. So there's a lot of interplay going on here. And I don't think that section has any impact on the legislation that requires sprinklers on the specific locations of this ordinance. So that's my understanding of it, is that this ordinance doesn't create a duty for the fire marshal or the city to inspect 1 and 2 family dwellings. This is simply saying that if you do something that causes you to put in a sprinkler system in a 1 and 2 family dwelling, you're going to get a permit. The fire department will do the inspections, but that's different from just coming in and doing a periodic inspection of the property. So there's 2 different things going on.
Right. That's what I thought too. Yeah.
But why is this change necessary? If you read it the way it was, it gives the fire department the authority to inspect wherever they have that authority. So,
well, but here's the problem, because here's the problem, because that in that same paragraph, to the fullest extent permitted by law, so could be the city, the fire department shall have the authority to enter and examine at all reasonable times any building or structure. So, you know, that conflict exists there because a citizen reading the code is not necessarily supposed to go to the fire code to determine what their rights and authorities are. That is a bit much. So our job is to try to make the code itself as clear as possible as to the rights and responsibilities, liabilities, and obligations of the citizenry. And so this makes it clear that when we say any building, we're not talking about their home.
So where I think the problem is that everybody quickly focuses on sprinklers. This is not talking about sprinklers, it's talking about inspections. And it's limiting, I think, unnecessarily, because the language already said to the extent permissible under the law, it's limiting the ability to inspect, period. Not inspect for sprinklers, but to inspect. But this is taking up too much. I'll take this up with Office of Law and with Mr. Manessa and Planning and Zoning Inspections. But I just think we went too far and we were affecting things that are citywide and not focused on the intent, the apparent intent of this legislation to sprinkle 2 specific areas downtown. And so I'm just, I'd like to get a clarification and I really want to understand why we're making these changes, because I think it does too much and it doesn't really speak to the specific intent for which this legislation was drawn. And I think there's a couple of other places where that happens. The meat of this legislation, again, as I understand it, is found back on page 8, and it has to do with sprinklers and minority contractors and things like that. Go ahead and make those changes, but why mess around with things that are broad inspection, not sprinkler inspection, but broad inspection powers of the city and are obviously limited by whatever state law allows us to do, which the language as currently written says. So, but again, thank you, Finance Committee. I guess I'll go pester Economic Matters as well, but I'm trying to understand if we're unintentionally changing things that don't need to be messed with in our zeal to zero down on sprinklers in a particular area in the city. Sprinklers are important to the whole city, but sprinklers are only part of fire inspection. business, as Mr. Manessa knows better than I. And I don't want to mess with our authorities to inspect that limit what we already are given by the state and don't need to touch. But
Alderman Arnett, the state gives us a floor with respect to inspections. The city can always add.
Well, this is subtracting, but I won't take up.
Not really. No, it's not subtracting.
Okay. Well,
it's in accordance with the state.
Yeah.
It makes us in accordance with the state.
Yeah. We can revisit this, but from my understanding, obviously, if we're introducing sprinkler legislation, this is the code that we amend. And by making the statements, and specifically in 17.20010 and 020, adopting the Uniform Fire Code and the Life Safety Code, that takes care of, like, that's the mega stuff. And then we distilled it down to specifically, for lack of better words, sort of mandating sprinklers in a certain area. I don't know how else we would have done this. In fairness to Michael, Mr. Lyles, he wasn't part of that initial decision to which code are we going to edit. He inherited this legislation, but he has vetted it. But that was the intent, is that this is the code that we're going to edit to. There's no other way, unless you have an idea, Alderman Arnett, on how you introduce sprinkler system mandate.
I think what you're touching is broader than sprinkler system. That's really my point.
Well,
when you're
correct.
getting into inspections writ large, we inspect for all kinds of things and for all kinds of reasons, and we have the authority to do that. So I think that the sprinkler changes should come further down in the code where they are, starting on page 8, and also where they are in Title 6 with the revolving fund, not messing around with the entire citywide inspection process. But again, I don't want to take up the committee's time. I'll set up an appointment to meet with the Office of Law, and John, if it's you, fine, or if it's somebody else from planning and zoning. But I just think we touched too much and didn't need to, and it's things that are not sprinkler specific. Taking my hand down.
All right. Thank you, John, for attending. And you have looked at the latest legislation, John, correct? So.
Yes, I'm looking at it.
Okay.
And I would point you back to Chief Ortlieb for further discussion on this. This is really editing the fire code section, not planning and zoning.
Correct. Sorry.
No problem.
I only brought that up as far as inspecting, the word inspecting, but you're right, that's all fire department. Does Mr. Ortlieb want to address anything in this legislation? I see that you're here.
No, the only thing I think John Manassa brought it up is we really have to, if we're going to look at it, then we have to look at changing the code. And we also adopted an NFPA. The NFPA doesn't give us the authority to enter in and do the inspections on a 1 and 2 single family dwelling. And that's something that we need to consider, although the fire department is all about sprinklers and making sure that life and property are protected. I think we just have to be cognizant of that. So if we're going to start going down that path, I think it's going to be a bigger task.
Okay. I think Alderman Arnett has a very valid point, because what we're left with now is a revised sprinkler code that may or may not address other things than specifying an area for sprinklers, and that has to that has to be vetted by all applicable parties, which I believe it was. So, anyways, are there any other questions or comments or concerns?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I think it might be appropriate, and I had to step away. I'm dealing with a family emergency right now, but would it be appropriate to postpone action on this legislation and ask Chief Romali, Mr. Manassa, Mr. Lyles, and anybody else who would touch this legislation to review it in light of the discussions that we've been having this morning. Because I believe that your intent is an honorable one, and we need to get it right. So to give them a chance to look at it again through the lens of this discussion might be very helpful.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, because there has been so much work on this that I think that we need everyone around the table to tell us that why this approach was done, and that it is maybe we'll need to revise the first paragraph if it includes more than just the allocated area to sprinkle. So is that a motion?
Yeah, I'll make a motion to postpone action on 0122.
I'll second that.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. And just to be clear, that would be Chief Romali, the law office. I'm trying to think who else was around the room. And John, if he could.
The fire chief, the city attorney, and anybody else who would have some impact or be impacted by.
Okay. All right. We have another piece of legislation, which is this resolution on R34-21. It's revision to the fee schedule, addressing projects that are under $500. I see that I'm a sponsor. Let's see, background to this came up when there was a railing project that the fee seemed very skewed compared to the volume of the project, and et cetera, et cetera. And upon research, we realized that we didn't address projects under $500. And I'm going to let City Manager Jarrell take it from there.
Sure. So, yeah, and Mr. Manassas here as well to address it. But so what we had in the fee schedule was projects from 500 to 25 would have a certain fees, both application permit fees, 25,000 up to 50 and so forth. But we didn't have the $0 to $500 projects covered. And those projects can take as much effort on the part of planning and zoning as the bigger projects, the ones up to 25,000. So the intention of this is just to close that gap, to make it read that project 0, or actually, I guess $1 up to 25,000 would have a certain application and permit fee. And so it covers those smaller projects. John, did I miss anything or misstate anything?
No, that's exactly it. You summarized it well. This stems from City Code probably 5 or 6 years ago. There was an exemption for permits under or work under $500. And we did away with that several years ago, but I guess we did not address that loophole in the fee schedule when we got rid of the under $500 exemption. So this just closes a loophole that should have been closed years ago.
So the policy issue on this is that the fee that we're charging projects under 500 is the same as those all the way up to 25,000. That's the flip side of this, right? So the application fee is 100, the permit fee is 150. So if you have a project that's $200, you're going to end up paying $250 for fees for a small project. So just wanted to make you aware that that's sort of the downside to this is you know, it's a lot of fees for a small project. But there's a lot of work on a lot of those projects by planning and zoning.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is sort of our position on it, is that whether it's a $10,000 project or a $100 project, essentially the fee is covering our processing time, the paperwork, the actual physical inspections on site, which are sort of the same, whether it be a $100 or a $10,000 project.
Yeah, I tell my constituents they're all A to Z jobs. anyways, Alderwoman O'Neill.
So I guess I have a question about that. If I am a resident who has a $200 project and I'm going to spend more in fees than the project is costing, isn't that going to just force me to maybe not seek permit for that? And not that I'm wanting to break the law, but I see it almost as pushing people to not seek permits when we are doubling their cost of their project by the fees. And also, I guess I would like to look at how many projects do we have permits for, or people seeking permits for in the past that are under $500. Because the staff report is saying that it will give us additional revenue, but I'm wondering if it will do the opposite.
It's a very valid question. That's what triggered me looking at this legislation, because there was a constituent that was arguing the fact that, but he was burdened with an application fee too. So we gave him back that money.
John, I don't know if you know the number of projects under 500, but we certainly agree that this creates a disincentive to either doing the project. Hopefully they would choose to not do the project and just not get permitted, right, and break the law. But I'm not sure how many projects we have that are under 500 normally. John, any idea?
It's very few. We did run that number. I don't have it sitting in front of me at the moment, but I think in the span of several years, there were only a couple permits that were that low. I'm talking less than 5 over the course of 2 years. And it, as you stated, it is sort of a disincentive, but if you're replacing a railing, it has to be done correctly and it has to withstand certain amount of force. It also has to be done so that people don't slip through the bottom. You know, there's a lot of requirements that go into something like a railing on a set of stairs. And for us to process the paperwork and go out and actually do an inspection, that's how we cover the cost. Unfortunately, it might be more money to do the inspection than it actually is to do the replacement railing. But I don't know how to do that unless you specifically offset those really small projects with a really light fee and just understand that we're going to lose money on them. You know, that's the way to look at it.
I would ask, on that logic, why are the gradations so low when you go up from 0 to 25 and the revised legislation is $100, and then you jump up 25 to 50,000 is 150 with a so you're sort of contradicting the argument that it's not based on value of work, because the fee does go up marginally with the estimated value of the work. But these were all, you evaluate your staff time on all of the collected projects and then just sort of allocated it accordingly, or, I mean, I know our fee justifies our cost.
Well, it's been several years since we had to study that and produce verifiable data. But what we've done in the past is look at the amount of work required for certain projects that fall into that lower price range. And a lot of times something like a railing doesn't get public works, and it doesn't get a public works review. It doesn't get a stormwater management review. For a railing replacement, all you're going to get is a building review, and in some cases, the HPC review. So the reviewer time is less on a really small project like that. And so the permit fees are less. As you get into bigger projects, they'd say it's an addition and you're adding square footage to a property, a structure, then you're getting that bigger review package. You're getting the building code review, you're getting the zoning review, you're getting public works. stormwater management, all of the different agencies are reviewing that. Fire might review it. So the fees go up because there's more legwork in getting all that done.
But not as much as you would think. I think I would suggest that, I know Dr. Nash looked at these fees last budget cycle. You can see, based on what you said, it only goes up, $50 for a project, increasing in size substantially. The gradations don't make sense proportionally with the value of the projects, using that argument. And to Alderwoman O'Neill's point, is there a way that you look at these fees and possibly not have a fee for projects under, bear with me, not have a fee for projects under $500 and then cover that cost elsewhere in the larger projects? I don't know. I don't know the balance.
Okay, just keep in mind there's two different fees that we're talking about. One of them is the application fee, which is the 0 to 25,000, and then it goes up from 25 to 50,000.
Oh, okay.
That's just the application fee. There's also actually the permit fee, which follows a much different schedule and ramps up more quickly. So if you're over $10,000, the actual permit fee is based on the value of the work and can be much more substantial. So there's sort of a two-step process to the fees. There's the fee to just drop off the application, and then there's the fee to pick up the permit in the end.
And that makes it even more not making sense, because the application fee would be $100 and then you just raise it to $50. The relationship between application and permit fees seems kind of odd. Alderman Arnett, I think, had his, Alderman Finlayson first, and then Alderman Arnett.
Thank you. I was going to ask the difference between these two fees, but Mr. Manasseh has just explained. One's an application and one is the actual permit. So for a small project, really, and I'm talking $500 now, it's going to cost $250 to get the application and then the permit. Am I reading this correctly?
Correct.
So this kind of speaks to what Alderwoman O'Neill was saying about a deterrent. But I heard you, Mr. Manasseh, when you said you only have a handful of these small projects. I guess my question is, what was the original fee? And maybe you said this and I missed it, for a project that's $500 or less. Was there an original fee?
Well, going back about 7 years, maybe, that work would have been exempt regardless. You could replace your handrail if it was less than $500 and not pull a permit. But that also created a problem that, some work that really truly did need to be inspected was being moved through because they were exempt. So we got rid of that exemption, like I said, 5 or 7 years ago, and said that work that requires an inspection has to have a permit. And we changed the city code that said, okay, you were exempt if it was under $500. It said now it doesn't matter what the amount of money is. If it needs an inspection, you have to have a permit. The fee schedule never got changed though. So we still didn't have anything for those really low dollar amounts in the code because prior to that point, it was exempt. There wasn't a need for a fee schedule for a $500 permit or less because it was just exempt.
But the work was being done in spite of.
Yeah, way back when the work was being done.
Yeah.
Now we get these small permits that say it was $300. You have to replace something that costs $300. You pull a permit. A couple of them went through and they just paid the fee. It wasn't until somebody actually complained and said, wait a minute, I'm being overcharged for this. And we had to go back and review and say, you know what? This actually falls outside of the fee schedule. There's no fee schedule for a permit that costs, $300. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're trying to address. The amount is still based on what it costs to do the paperwork and the inspection. So that's what you're seeing in that that $250 fee that's being charged is to cover the paperwork and the inspection.
Maybe I don't have a clear understanding of what's required when one submits an application. I think I understand what's required when someone receives a permit, because in my mind, the permit's connected to an inspection. I'm not clear on the application fee. Is that something that could be, does it really cost us $100 to process an application fee for a project that's $300?
Well, that's where it's sort of the same in this fee schedule. It doesn't, the process for intaking a permit, creating the records and track it, and bringing that, making sure that the application is complete and giving it to the permit administrator is the same process essentially for every permit. And it doesn't matter whether the work was worth $500 or $25,000, it's still the same process. And we have so many people that might apply for a permit and then abandon the project, and in which case we can't do all that work and not have an upfront fee. So that's the upfront fee to make sure that if we're going to start processing all this paperwork, that's compensated. And that's why there's an application fee. And later on, once we issue a permit and we know we're going to have to do a lot of inspections, there's a separate fee for that. That is the more comprehensive fee.
Okay. Is there a consideration, and I don't want to belabor this, but for those small projects, and you said it was a handful over the last several years. So what if we had a separate category for 500 and below, 0 to 500?
We did.
And we made it a very minimal amount, $50, $25, you know, just to, and maybe that wouldn't be enough of a, I don't know what the word is. It's not deterrent, but maybe it wouldn't be enough to make sure they follow through with the project. But it just seems, you know, it seems a bit excessive. But I understand the work that's related to it. And you just clarified that for me. So I have an understanding. I just think that maybe we could give a little something to those people who bring in those little projects that are for $500. We're going to make the money on the big projects, and that's the majority of the projects. So how about we be generous and do something for those little projects that, you know, maybe it won't cover our costs, but it's a, I don't want to say it's a right thing, but it's a accommodating thing to do for our residents. Just a thought. Thank you, John. Mr. Manassas, sorry.
Sure, you won't find any objection from me on that kind of philosophy. I think that would be appropriate. And there are so few of them that we're not talking about losing a great deal.
Okay.
So Alderwoman, would you consider, this is your legislation, isn't it? Yours and the mayor's, creating a separate little category above for application fee that's 0 to 500 and make it $25
Yeah.
or whatever you guys say.
But could we also ask, I don't know if it's part of this discussion, could we also ask for a relook of these fees in this budget cycle?
Well, that should happen anyway.
It should,
I think.
Yeah, it should. Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's
But
really
what are you going to do? What are you going to do with this legislation?
I think we can make your recommendation if you want to make a motion. First, Alderman Arnett just has his hand up. I just want to say something with definitely due respect. Your arguments on the last item on the agenda may have swayed this committee in recommending or not recommending. You can't appear in another committee meeting and sway the vote, if you will. So just that may be overstepping. So just keep your comments to comments and not as not a contributing voice to sway the vote, if you will. I think you understand that.
I actually don't understand. Are you saying I cannot go to Economic Matters and ask them questions? And that's what I was doing, was asking questions and pointing out changes that, first of all, I have a problem with, which I think is my right as a council member. But secondly, we're really legitimately asking questions about why we're even bothering to touch that part of the legislation of the city code when, in fact, the real focus was further down the road at sprinklering. So again, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying to me. I think all council members are invited to attend committee meetings. Certainly you attended finance committee meetings in the previous administration.
Yeah, it's just try not to be opinionated so that it sways the vote. You know, comments are appreciated, of course, in your attendance. So I'm just looking at legal guidelines I've been presented with. So
I'd like to see those legal guidelines, but the day that a council member can't have an opinion, I think is not something we can legislate. Getting to the reason I had my hand raised, which was initially to relate to you the exact history that Mr. Manessa relayed to you, and it even goes back further than that. At one point, anything under $500 was defined as work in kind and didn't require any permitting or inspection. But I think both you, Alderwoman Tierney, the Madam Chair, and Alderwoman Finlayson have struck on the right solution here, in that potentially we could globally let the bigger projects support the cost of the really small ones, and then speak to Alderwoman O'Neill's concern about having a negative impact. I think a very small fee does sound like it could be something that could be workable, but I really wanted to put to you and Alderwoman O'Neill a question that has to do with the sister committee, which is the audit committee, and it speaks to what you yourself raised, and also Alderwoman Finlayson. I think we really need to look at the kinds of issues that Mr. Manessa is raising about whether our fees really do cover the costs of doing work. I know that's something that gets an annual review when we look at the fees in the annual budget. But I think there's a broader issue here that we need to pay attention to. As Mr. Manessa points out, there's an awful lot of work that has to go into both the permit and even the application that these fees don't properly cover. On the other hand, there's this downside negative incentive to get a permit or file an application if the application costs more than the work. So I'm wondering if that could go into our risk analysis at audit committee.
Okay.
Whoops, go down hand.
All right. So did Alderwoman Finlayson want to make a motion about isolating the fee?
I will, Madam Chair, make the motion that we create a new category of $0 to $500 for application fee for the amount of $25. Mr. Manessa, is that good?
Yes, I think it's appropriate.
Okay. Should that also apply to the permit fee? Or should there be another category? Or, I mean, what about the permit fee? Mr. Manassa, I'm looking for your guidance.
Yeah, I was just looking back at the fee schedule, and yeah, I think that's appropriate as well. I think 25 for the application, 25 for the permit in that under $500 range would be good.
Mhm. Okay, so that would be my motion, that for both the application fee and the permit fee, there be a category of $0 to $500, and the fee would be $25 for each.
I second that.
Thank you. And I hope Ms. Green got all of that.
All right. Well, all in
I got it.
Thank you.
All in favor of the amended recommendation by Alderwoman Finlayson, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All right.
Now,
Yeah.
if I might, I have another question about page 2 of the legislation, and that is the filing fees in all of them, 1705.130 on down to 1760.170. All of those fees have almost been doubled, and I'd like to understand why. What has transpired that makes us want to increase those fees significantly?
Is that for me?
If you have the answer, absolutely. Thank you.
I can give you our rationale, and that is on the prior year fee schedule. For some reason, and I don't know exactly why, one of the, and it's not on this list because it's already done, but 1711, I'm not sure which subsection, but 1711 last year was changed to 450 for the appeal. And it was our assumption that that was the intention across the board, that all of the appeals are the same. That 1711 just happens to be floodplain code. But that all of the appeals should have been the same fee because it's the same process, the same board. So we were adjusting all of them to the same level, that they're all 450. I think there again, there's an argument to be made that there's disincentive in some cases to file an appeal if it's that expensive, but it makes no sense to have an appeal under 1711 be 450 and then 1708 or 1740 be 250 when it's the same process. So that's the intent there. So somebody raised it to 450, like they should all be the same.
So let me ask, we're only looking at what, probably 8 different fees to change. Are there, for example, at 1705 is the first one that we have. Is there a 1706 that was changed and a 1707 that was changed? 1708 is on our list, but then that jumps down to 1734. Are there appeals in between all of those that have already been changed? Does that make sense?
The only one that was already changed was 1711. The other numbers are not sequential necessarily, so there might not be a 1706 at all.
Okay.
So what we did is we looked at every section of city code that refers to the Building Board of Appeals, and that's what you see numbered in that sequence is all the sections that dealt with Building Board of Appeals, minus 1711, which has already been changed previously. So this covers every other reference to Building Board of Appeals filings.
It does feel like a deterrent, an attempt at a deterrent. And I could be wrong. That's just, it looks like we're targeting. And I understand since we've done one, we should be consistent with the other. But was the first one done correctly? Should that have been changed to begin with?
I will have to say that I wasn't aware of the other one changing until it came out as the end product of the legislation. So that one, we didn't have input on why that one changed to 450 in the previous year. It just came out as that's the new amount for that particular filing. And we assumed that that was the intent of council.
Yeah, I think that was a good way of putting that, John. This one surprised me as well. The staff report does say that it was increased from 250 to 450 to reflect the increased staff costs of managing these appeals through the entire process. Does City Manager Gerald have any input on, was this cost reevaluated to make this change? Sorry, Alderwoman O'Neill. Just quick.
I do not. So when the one fee was raised to 450, I'm not sure why that was done. I'm not sure why the others were not raised at the same time.
Oh, okay. So this is sort of a correction? Oh, Director Dickinson.
Yeah, I would just add that each year, at least for the years that I've been here, planning and zoning's been very good about reevaluating their fees as we go through the budget process and adjust them accordingly. And it may be that 450 that got increased originally was a part of that annual process, and the other ones just didn't increase. And I'd have to look back at the budget process to see about the others that didn't follow suit. But the idea is the fees are set to recoup the cost of providing the service. So if that's our policy, we're going to recoup the costs, and they all cost the same to process, I would think that you'd change the fees on the appeal process to be equal. But that's a policy decision as to whether or not the deterrence outweighs the cost of recouping the cost of the processing.
I know Dr. Nash did a real thorough review of these last budget cycle and changed the one, and that's all I know. And so to align these with those, that makes sense in that respect. But Alderwoman O'Neill.
My question / comment was going to be along those lines, is that if we changed one and the intent was perhaps we should have been changing them all, then they should all be changed. But I would go back to, to the evaluation of the cost of, working through the staff cost of working through those appeals. And before we make the across the board change, perhaps in the budgeting process, we should have a second look at that, especially since, not to negate anything that Dr. Nash has done in the past, but she's not here. So perhaps Finance Director Dickinson could lead the charge on that to make sure that if we are increasing everything almost twofold from 250 to 450, that is in effect what we need to do before we make a blanket change to everything.
Yeah, it goes to the request of reevaluating all of these, this budget cycle, right? And
so I'm not sure what you've asked me to do. So as far as the cost of what it costs to provide the services, that's best performed by the department that's doing it. If you're asking me to make a policy decision on whether or not we should value the permit fee should be equal to the cost or equal to some other measure, that's not something I would do either. That has to come from higher up. So I'm not sure what she wanted me to do.
My ask was just that if in the past the floods, I believe Mr. Manasseh was saying that 1707, I believe, was the one that was changed, or
11,
sorry. 11 was changed, and then the rest of them were not. Was it an oversight that the rest of them were not, or was it the fact that we had 15 of those, and so it made sense to be looking at just the one? But I think that they should all sort of be covered under the same. If the cost of taking them to an appeal is all the same number of staffs and whatnot, then they should all be equal, correct?
So, Alderman O'Neill, we will do that. I understand completely what you're asking. So we'll go back to planning and zoning and ask that question, what the 450 that was changed was based on, and if that is legitimate, and whether that should be applied to all these other ones. It seems like by including it in this, the feeling was that it was mistakenly omitted from all of these other fees, and it was just included in that one. But we'll double check that so we can another item to come back.
Yeah.
To the next finance committee. But I do think that we need to check on that, and then we need to report back on whether the first one that was changed to 450 is legitimate, which I think it was, but based on what factors, and then do those apply to these other fees?
Thank you very much.
May I ask that we find out what 11 was or is? Because most of these have some specific purpose, fences, maintenance code, rental, and et cetera. So what is 11? Because maybe that was associated with some piece of legislation that we were dealing with last year.
Yeah. Can that be part of your evaluation?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Alderwoman Finlayson, for bringing up page 2, because I think it was a surprise. It was a surprise to me. I just thought this was for the infamous $500 projects. All righty. So can I entertain a motion to postpone action on that and add it to the agenda for next meeting for discussion?
I will make a motion to move this to the next meeting based on new numbers from City Manager Gerald.
I will second the motion to postpone action on, what is it, R3421.
All right. Thank you. All in favor by signifying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. I think we've, oh, no, sorry, Director Dickinson. And we are over 12:30. Can we keep going? I'm not sure who's, Takia, is that okay?
Yes, you're fine.
Okay. Director Dickinson, you have an update for us?
I just usually provide a quick report on what we've been working on here in the Office of Finance, besides our daily work that keeps us very busy, and the various assignments that come to us through the committees, like we just talked about today. We're working hard on a few things. One, we're trying to get the annual comprehensive financial report out the door. That's almost done. The auditors are doing their final review, so that should be out in a week or two. We started the budget process. Katie is very involved in pulling those department requests together and the capital budget together. And that's taking up all of her time and some of mine. We're working on the union negotiations, and my department is assigned with coming up with some of the economic calculations of any changes we're going to make, and projections as to where this year will turn out, and FY23 will be with revenues and expenses. And then we've got the Hillman Garage project that's also on its final negotiation stage, and that's taking up a lot of time as well. And besides that, I've just finished my draft of the RFP for audit services, and I have somebody reviewing that. Jim Cardillo is helping me by giving a second set of eyes to the language to make sure that I haven't missed something. And then Brian Snyder and I will get that out in the public to request bids. And then the only other thing is the staffing vacancies, which I talked about before. We're still working on those.
Any questions?
Can we thank Mr. Cadillo? We're thanking him by putting him back on the fact.
and audit. He's on audit as well.
Yeah, he's doing this based on his role on the audit committee, because the audit committee is the one who is and he offered to help look at that if I need somebody else to take a look. So
yes, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions other than thank you to Director Dickinson?
Thank you.
All right. Well, it's 12:45. Can I entertain a motion to adjourn because the agenda is completed?
So
Motion
moved.
to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for attending. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.